A new record for the state of Florida. Governor DeSantis has signed the 9th death warrant this year, the most for any governor since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. The latest execution set for former Eglin Air Force Base airman Edward Zakrzewski. He's convicted of killing his wife and 2 children. In 1996, Zakrzewski pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder, receiving 3 death sentences.
He raised his right hand and swore an oath to the United States of America, to protect, to serve, to defend. Edward James Zakrzewski II earned the rank of Technical Sergeant in the United States Air Force. That rank does not come easy. It takes years of discipline, performance, and proven leadership. He was 29 years old on June 9, 1994. By the end of that night, his wife and both of his children were gone. 31 years later, on July 31, 2025, the state of Florida strapped him to a gurney. It was Florida's 9th execution of that year alone, a modern state record not seen since 1976. Before we get to that chamber, we need to go back to the beginning. Welcome to the last sentence. This case is one that the American news cycle almost erased completely. Not because it was insignificant, not because the facts were unclear, but because of what else was happening that same week. An event so consuming that it pulled the attention of an entire nation away from a mother and her 2 children who deserved to be front-page news. We are going to talk about that. And when we get to it, you will understand exactly how something this serious got buried. There is something else you need to hold on to as we go through this case. This man did not accept his sentence quietly. For 31 years he fought it. Through every level of the state court system. Through the federal courts, and finally all the way to the United States Supreme Court. They turned him down. Every single court. Without one dissenting voice at the highest level. If you want to follow cases like this one, cases that nearly disappeared from public record, subscribe to this channel right now. That is exactly what we are here for. Every week, we cover the people and the cases that did not get the attention they deserved. Now let us get into what actually happened. Edward James Zakrzewski II was born on January 31, 1965, in Kalamazoo, Michigan, of Polish descent. After a brief period in college, he enlisted in the United States Air Force. He was disciplined, focused, and capable. He worked his way up to the rank of Technical Sergeant, a supervisory non-commissioned officer position that requires consistent performance and demonstrated leadership over years of service. By 1994, he had returned to education, attending night college while maintaining his military career. He was 1 year away from completing his degree. On paper, he was a man with a career, an education, and a future in front of him. The woman who became his wife was born in South Korea. Her given name was Ponem. Before meeting Edward, she had been married to another American military man, a relationship her family back in South Korea openly disapproved of. That marriage ended with no children. She was working at the Air Force Base Exchange store in Montana, confirmed through defense attorney court testimony, when she met Edward Zakrzewski. They married after she became pregnant, and she adopted the American name Sylvia. She was 34 years old at the time of her death. Together they had 2 children. Their son, Edward Zakrzewski III, was 7 years old and known within the family by his Korean middle name, Kim. Their daughter, Anna Zakrzewski, was 5 years old. Between 1989 and 1992, the family was stationed in South Korea. For Sylvia, those years were the closest she had felt to peace since leaving her homeland. But court documents later revealed she faced discrimination there for being married to an American and for having mixed-race children. The return she had longed for carried complications she had not anticipated. In 1992, new orders came. The family relocated to Mary Esther in Okaloosa County, Florida, near Eglin Air Force Base. In April of 1994, they purchased their first home together on Shrewsbury Road, 40 miles east of Pensacola. From the outside, it looked like a family building something permanent. Behind that front door, the marriage was falling apart. Sylvia wanted to return to South Korea. She had told people around her that she intended to go back and planned to take the children with her when she did. Before June 9, 1994, there was already a warning. A neighbor of the Zakrzewski family heard Edward Zakrzewski state on at least 2 separate occasions that he would end his family's lives before he would accept a divorce. He said it directly. He said it more than once. That neighbor made the decision to stay silent, not to Sylvia, not to anyone at Eglin Air Force Base, not to law enforcement. That information remained buried until investigators were already standing inside the house on Shrewsbury Road. Retired Assistant State Attorney Bobby Elmore, who prosecuted this case, later described what law enforcement found inside that house as the worst crime scene he encountered in his entire career. Detective Joe Nelson of the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office, the lead investigator assigned to the case, said the same. 2 experienced professionals, both of whom had seen serious criminal cases throughout their careers, and both pointed to this one as unlike anything else they had worked. But the investigation revealed something about the timeline that reframes the entire case. The night before the murders, the evening of June 8, 1994, Zakrzewski went on a drinking binge. That same night, he withdrew more than $5,400 from the couple's joint bank account. That withdrawal happened before his son called him at work the following morning. Before any conversation about divorce occurred on June 9. The money was already gone the night before. Circuit Judge G. Robert Barron, who presided over this case, addressed this directly. He described what Zakrzewski carried out as the product of months, and undeniably hours, of cool, calm reflection and deliberate planning. Not a reaction to a phone call. A decision that had already been made. June 9, 1994 began as a standard workday. Edward Zakrzewski reported to Eglin Air Force Base that morning on time in uniform, with nothing in his conduct signaling anything unusual to those around him. Then his son called. 7-year-old Edward, known to the family as Kim, reached his father at the base that morning with a message. His mother wanted a divorce and planned to take the children back to South Korea. Whether Sylvia directed her son to make that call has never been conclusively established. What the documented record shows is what Zakrzewski did in the hours that followed. During his lunch break, he drove to an army surplus store and purchased a machete. He then went to the house on Shrewsbury Road before returning to the base. Inside the house, he sharpened the blade. He positioned a crowbar in the bedroom. He cut a length of rope. 3 items, each prepared and placed before his family set foot through that door. He then returned to Eglin Air Force Base and completed his shift. Every colleague who encountered him that afternoon reported nothing out of the ordinary. After leaving the base, he stopped at a local bar and met with a fellow military veteran. During that conversation, Zakrzewski raised a question. He asked what a person must feel when they take another person's life. His friend registered it as a passing remark and thought nothing further of it. He would later repeat that exchange to investigators. Zakrzewski returned home that evening. He sent the children to watch television and called for Sylvia to come to the bedroom. She did not come. He went to the living room, located her, and struck her with the crowbar. No argument preceded it. No exchange of words. The case record documents the assault as immediate and without provocation. He moved Sylvia to the bedroom where the assault continued before he used the rope to strangle her. Medical examiner Dr. Edward Harvard, who conducted the post-mortem examination and later testified in court, confirmed that despite sustaining a fractured skull and multiple wounds to her back, Sylvia was still alive at the point of strangulation. She was 34 years old. Zakrzewski then called his 7-year-old son Edward into the bathroom and told him to brush his teeth. Then, separately, he called 5-year-old Anna into the same room. Dr. Harvard's autopsy findings documented that both children had injuries on their arms and hands consistent with defensive wounds, the kind sustained when a person instinctively raises their limbs to protect themselves. At 7 and 5 years old, they both did exactly that. Bloodstain analyst Jan Johnson testified during the court proceedings that based on her analysis of the physical evidence, Anna had been positioned in a kneeling posture over the edge of the bathtub when she was struck. Her brother was already there. The forensic record confirmed that Anna had witnessed what happened to Edward before the same fate reached her. Zakrzewski placed all 3 members of his family together in the bathroom. He went to the sink, washed up, changed into clean clothing and left the house. He drove to a bar and remained there for several hours, drinking heavily until he was severely intoxicated. Later that night, police officers on patrol found him passed out in his car. They took his keys, told him to collect them from the station in the morning, and left. They had no reason to look further. No reason to connect him to anything beyond a man who had too much to drink. They had no idea what was inside the house on Shrewsbury Road. The morning of June 10, 1994. Zakrzewski did not have his car keys. Police had taken them the night before. He returned to Shrewsbury Road on foot and forced entry through a window. Inside, he changed into his work uniform, found a spare key, and drove to Eglin Air Force Base. He reported in. He gave no indication to anyone around him that anything had occurred. He left before his shift ended. He drove to the bank and withdrew the remaining balance from the account. Then he drove to Orlando International Airport and boarded a flight to Hawaii. By the time that plane was airborne, no one in Florida knew where he had gone. The house sat untouched for 3 days. On June 13, Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office investigators entered and processed the property. Detective Joe Nelson led that work. 3 pieces of forensic evidence emerged immediately. First, blood was found on the living room couch, located beneath a shirt belonging to Zakrzewski. Second, blood was recovered from a pair of his socks inside the laundry hamper. He had changed clothes before leaving, and what he left behind connected him directly to what had taken place inside that house. Third, his blue 1992 Geo Prism was not on the property. Not stolen. Not towed. Simply gone alongside its owner. In the context of everything else recovered at that scene, a missing vehicle registered to the primary suspect was treated immediately as evidence of deliberate flight. Detective Nelson later stated that in his entire law enforcement career, he had never worked a scene of that nature. That assessment required no elaboration. Investigators built the physical case methodically before moving to the next step. The formal arrest warrant for Edward James Zakrzewski II was issued on June 16, 1994, 3 days after the bodies were discovered. When law enforcement moved, the documented record was fully behind them. On June 13, 1994, personnel from Eglin Air Force Base arrived at the house on Shrewsbury Road. Zakrzewski had failed to report for duty and had been flagged as absent without leave. They contacted the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office. Deputies responded and met them at the property. They found a broken window. They went inside. Retired Assistant State Attorney Bobby Elmore later described what law enforcement encountered in that house as the worst crime scene of his entire professional career. For a prosecutor with his level of experience, that statement carries full weight. Edward Zakrzewski was identified as the prime suspect without delay. The FBI was brought in. The United States Marshals Service joined the investigation. His family home in Kalamazoo, Michigan was placed under active surveillance. Every known contact was reached and questioned. Nothing came back. No confirmed sightings. No reliable information pointing to his location. The trail was gone. Now here is the context that explains why this case received almost no national media coverage despite its severity. The night before the bodies were discovered, Sunday, June 12, 1994, the bodies of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were found outside Nicole's home in Brentwood, California. By the morning of June 13, O.J. Simpson had been publicly named as the prime suspect. On that same Monday, the exact day deputies were processing the scene on Shrewsbury Road, a white Ford Bronco moved slowly down a California freeway with O.J. Simpson inside. That pursuit was broadcast live to an estimated 95 million viewers across the country. 95 million people watched that freeway. Sylvia Zakrzewski. Edward Zakrzewski III, 7 years old. Anna Zakrzewski, 5 years old. 3 people whose case deserved national attention received almost none of it. The story was buried before most of the country ever heard it. On November 19, 1994, Zakrzewski was formally indicted in Okaloosa County on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The legal framework was in place. The prosecution was ready. All that remained was bringing him back to face it. Edward Zakrzewski landed in Hawaii with one deliberate advantage. He had no history there. No family. No former contacts. No connection of any kind that investigators could follow. That was not coincidence. It was the reason he chose Hawaii specifically. He arrived in Maui first and kept a low profile while his funds held. When the money ran out, he moved to Molokai, one of the smaller and more remote islands in the chain. He was living under a false name. He presented himself as Michael Ray Green. Some documentation from the period also lists the alias as Robert Michael Green. On Molokai, he met a pastor and his wife operating a religious commune on the island. He introduced himself using his alias and presented himself as someone looking for work and a fresh start. The arrangement was straightforward: maintenance and handyman work in exchange for accommodation in a small structure on the property. After roughly 2 weeks, he was joining the family inside the main house for meals and evening television. For 4 months that held. The FBI and U.S. Marshals were working every lead on the mainland. Zakrzewski was sitting in a pastor's living room on a remote Hawaiian island under a name that did not exist in any connected database. Then came October 14, 1994. Unsolved Mysteries aired that evening. The Zakrzewski segment appeared not as a featured story but as part of a short fugitive hotline block alongside 2 other wanted individuals, Alan Verl Sneed and Nasario Palacios. Even the broadcast that ended his run did not treat him as a headline case. The pastor and his wife were watching. Zakrzewski was in the room with them. When his photograph appeared on screen, the pastor turned to him and noted the resemblance directly. Zakrzewski acknowledged it, dismissed it, and moved on. The pastor and his wife were not satisfied with that response. They planned to confront him again the following morning. When they went to his accommodation on October 15th, it was empty. He had left during the night. The only thing remaining was a handwritten note that read, "I'm sorry." That same morning, Zakrzewski walked into a police station on Molokai Island and surrendered. He gave his real name. The search was over. On October 25, 1994, he was extradited back to Florida. Zakrzewski had been back in Florida less than a year when he tried to run again. In August 1995, while held at Okaloosa County Jail, he and another inmate were caught attempting to escape at the perimeter fence. A man facing 3 counts of first-degree murder still tried to walk away from accountability. On March 19, 1996, he entered guilty pleas to all 3 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence left him no other credible path. The penalty phase followed. The jury would determine life or death. Defense attorneys Isaac Caron and Elton Killam focused entirely on mitigation. They presented his military service record and pointed to a claimed religious conversion in custody. Zakrzewski took the stand and expressed remorse. Attorney Killam argued he acted toward his children out of mercy, claiming he feared they would face discrimination as mixed-race children in South Korea. Killam used the word half-breeds in open court. He also raised allegations that Sylvia had been unfaithful, accumulated debt, and frequented gambling establishments while stationed in Korea. None of those allegations were proven. They remained unverified claims presented solely as mitigation. Prosecutor Bobby Elmore countered with the physical record in precise sequence. The machete purchased at lunch. The sharpened blade. The pre-cut rope. The crowbar staged in the bedroom. The bank withdrawal the night before. He also introduced Zakrzewski's personal writings referencing Friedrich Nietzsche, directly dismantling the religious remorse narrative with Zakrzewski's own words. The jury voted 7-5 for death on the murders of Sylvia and Edward III. On Anna's murder they deadlocked 6-6. Judge G. Robert Barron overrode that deadlock. He sentenced Zakrzewski to death on all 3 counts, citing 3 aggravating factors: prior capital offenses, cold and calculated planning, and especially heinous cruelty. The date was April 19, 1996. The sentence imposed on April 19, 1996 carried a legal question that would not be resolved for 3 decades. A 7-5 jury vote. A deadlocked 6-6 on 1 count. A judge who overrode both to impose death across all 3. Under Florida law today, that path no longer exists. Current Florida law requires a minimum 8-4 jury majority for a death sentence. Zakrzewski's case never reached that threshold on any count. Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty stated publicly that in no other state in the country, and not even under present-day Florida law, Would those jury numbers have produced an execution? His attorneys raised that argument at every available level. Every court rejected it. The Florida Supreme Court dismissed his first appeal on June 12, 1998. The U.S. Supreme Court denied review in January 1999. Post-conviction appeals were rejected in 2003. The 11th Circuit dismissed his case in 2006 and rejected a second appeal in 2009. A further appeal was dismissed in 2018. That same year, the Zakrzewski family murders were formally designated as one of the most heinous crimes in the history of Northwest Florida. On July 1, 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant. Zakrzewski's legal team filed a final petition to the United States Supreme Court. On July 30th, one day before the scheduled execution, it was denied without a single dissenting voice. 31 years of appeals. Everyone denied. That closes the second question raised at the start of this documentary. Outside the prison, the Action Network organized a public petition urging the governor to halt the execution. Maria de Liberato of Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty led a prayer service outside Florida State Prison that day. One final detail. In 1998, Gulf War veteran Jeffrey Hutchinson was convicted of fatally shooting his girlfriend and her 3 children in the same Okaloosa County. He was also sentenced to death and executed on May 1, 2025, 3 months before Zakrzewski. 2 military-connected men. Same county. Both executed in the same year. July 31, 2025. Florida State Prison near Stark. Paul Walker, Deputy Communications Director for the Florida Department of Corrections, confirmed the official details of that day. Zakrzewski woke at 5:15 in the morning. His final meal was fried pork chops, fried onions, potatoes, bacon, buttered toast, root beer, ice cream, pie, and coffee. One visitor came that morning. Their identity was not disclosed. No spiritual advisor was requested. No family members from either side were present. Detective Joe Nelson made the 4-hour drive to the prison. The lead investigator who had worked this case since June of 1994 had never attended an execution in his career. He attended this one. Before the procedure began, Zakrzewski recited lines from Robert Frost's poem Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. He stopped before completing it. Then he delivered his final words. I want to thank the good people of the Sunshine State for killing me in the most cold, calculated, clean, humane, efficient way possible. I have no complaint. Cold. Calculated. The same words Judge Barron used in 1996 to describe the planning behind June 9, 1994. Zakrzewski was pronounced dead at 6:12 in the evening. It was Florida's 9th execution of 2025, a modern state record. Texas and South Carolina each recorded 4 that same year. Florida had not reached that number since 1976. Outside the prison, Detective Nelson spoke to reporters. His words were brief and direct. It's over now. It needed to stop. This case leaves behind facts that are hard to set aside. A neighbor heard Edward Zakrzewski threaten his family on more than one occasion and chose to say nothing. Not to Sylvia. Not to anyone. A 7-year-old boy made a phone call to his father one morning with no understanding of what it would set in motion. Sylvia wanted to go home. She spent years trying to get back to South Korea. She never made it. Anna was 5 years old. She never got the chance to grow up. And the country nearly missed all of it because of what was unfolding on a California freeway that same week. 3 people who deserved full national attention were passed over completely. The jury deadlocked on Anna's murder. Under Florida law as it stands today, that deadlock would have meant life in prison. A judge overrode it. Under current Florida law, that override would not have been permitted. Was that justice? Or a system bending its own rules to reach a conclusion it had already decided on? Leave your answer in the comments below. Sylvia Zakrzewski, 34 years old. Edward Zakrzewski III, known as Kim, 7 years old. Anna Zakrzewski, 5 years old. Edward James Zakrzewski II was born on January 31, 1965. He was executed on July 31, 2025. Exactly 60 years to the day. His wife and children never came close to that number. Detective Joe Nelson first walked into that house on Shrewsbury Road in June of 1994. He carried this case for 31 years. On July 31, 2025, he drove 4 hours to Florida State Prison to sit in that witness room and see it through to the end. That says everything about what these 3 lives meant to the people who refused to let this case disappear. If this documentary reached you, share it. Most people have never heard the names Sylvia, Edward, and Anna Zakrzewski. That needs to change.
A military jury at Fort Hood, Texas today sentenced Army Major Nidal Hasan to death for killing 13 people and wounding more than 30 in a 2009 attack. He could become the first American soldier to be executed since 1961. The American-born Muslim has said he acted to protect Islamic insurgents in Iraq and Afghanistan. He represented himself at his court-martial but offered no defense.
The man holding the gun had medals on his chest, a medical degree on his wall, and the trust of every soldier in that room. He used all 3 to get close enough to kill them. In December 2008, an email landed in an FBI inbox. The sender was a United States Army officer, a commissioned psychiatrist with full security clearance, trusted with the mental health of American soldiers returning from war. The question he was directing at a man already under federal surveillance was whether it was religiously permissible to take the lives of American military personnel. The FBI read it. They read the next one. And the one after that. 18 emails in total. Each one reviewed. Each one assessed. Their official conclusion, consistent with authorized research. File closed. 11 months later, 13 people were dead inside the Soldier Readiness Processing Center at Fort Hood, Texas. At the time, the largest active-duty military installation in the United States. The man who sent those emails was not a foreign operative. He held no place on a watch list. He was Major Nidal Malik Hasan, a United States Army psychiatrist whose entire career was built on the promise of protecting the soldiers around him. This is not a story about one act of violence. It is a documented record of warnings issued, evidence gathered, and decisions made, and not made, by the institutions responsible for preventing exactly what happened on November 5, 2009. What you are about to hear is accurate. It is verified. And every layer of it is more disturbing than the last. If this is your first time on this channel, we go further than the headline. We cover the evidence, the failures, and the courtroom details that most coverage never reaches. Subscribe and hit the bell. This story has layers most people have never heard, and we are just getting started. Nidal Malik Hasan was born on September 8, 1970, at Virginia Hospital Center in Arlington, Virginia. To anyone looking in from the outside, this was a family building something real in America. His parents were Palestinian immigrants, naturalized American citizens who had made their way from Al-Bayer, a city in the West Bank near Jerusalem. They did not arrive with much, but they worked. His father established multiple businesses in Roanoke, Virginia, a market, a restaurant, and an olive bar. His mother, Nora, ran the Capitol Restaurant, a place known in the local community not just for its food, but for her willingness to provide a warm meal to anyone who could not afford one. By every measure, they were a family that believed in contribution. Growing up, Nidal went by a different name entirely. His childhood nickname was Michael, a name as American as the country his parents had chosen to build their lives in. He attended Wakefield High School in Arlington. When the family relocated to Roanoke in 1986, he transferred to William Fleming High School, where he graduated in 1988. What happened next surprised his parents. Against their wishes, Nidal Hasan enlisted in the United States Army. He did not walk away from education. For the next 8 years, he served as an enlisted soldier while simultaneously working his way through college. He started at Barstow Community College in California, transferred to Virginia Western Community College where he earned his associate degree in 1992, and then moved on to Virginia Tech, where he graduated with a degree in biochemistry, with honors, in 1995. The United States Army then funded his place at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences in Bethesda, Maryland, one of the most competitive military medical programs in the country. He later added a master's degree in public health. By 2003, Nidal Hasan had earned his medical degree. He went on to complete his psychiatry specialization at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. On paper, this was a story of discipline, sacrifice, and achievement. But during those years of training, something was quietly shifting. In 1997, Hasan visited relatives in the West Bank for the first time. It was his first direct connection to the land his parents had left behind, and by multiple accounts, it deepened his sense of religious and cultural identity in ways that those around him began to notice in the years that followed. Then came two losses that, by several accounts, left a permanent mark. His father passed away in 1998 at just 51 years old. His mother, Nora, the woman who had fed strangers without asking anything in return, died in 2001 at 49. Both were gone before Hasan had completed his training. His mother's funeral was held on May 31, 2001, at the Dar al-Hijra Islamic Center in Falls Church, Virginia. It was there, at that service, that Nidal Hasan came back into contact with a figure who would, in time, play a significant role in the direction his life would take. That name and what followed belongs to a later part of this story. What is documented is this. His cousin, Virginia attorney Nader Hasan, later stated publicly that Nidal's perspective began to shift after years of listening to soldiers in his care describe their experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan. Session after session. Account after account. The wars his country was fighting in Muslim-majority nations were no longer something distant. They were sitting across from him, every day, in the form of the people he was supposed to be helping. The man the army had trained, funded, and trusted was beginning to see the institution differently. And the institution, for its part, was not paying close enough attention to notice. Nidal Hasan arrived at Walter Reed Army Medical Center with credentials, government funding, and a clear path forward. What followed was something the Army's own records could not ignore. The psychiatry residency was designed to be completed in 4 years. Hasan took 6. But the deeper concern was not the timeline, it was what the timeline concealed. Over 38 weeks he saw approximately 30 patients. The expected standard was closer to 300. He was not answering emergency on-call lines. He was failing basic shift duties. On one formally documented occasion, a patient classified as a danger to others was allowed to leave the emergency room without supervision on his watch. He was also reprimanded multiple times for introducing his personal religious beliefs into clinical sessions and directing patients toward Islam during treatment. In May 2007, Dr. Scott Moran, Chief of Psychiatric Residents at Walter Reed, filed a formal memo to the hospital's Credentials Committee. It documented poor judgment, lack of professionalism, and direct concerns about patient safety. That same month, Lieutenant Colonel Ben Phillips graded Hasan's performance as outstanding on his official evaluation. 2 documents. 2 completely opposing conclusions. Filed at the same time within the same institution. 1 month later, Hasan delivered a required senior academic presentation. Instead of a clinical topic, he submitted 50 slides titled The Quranic Worldview as it Relates to Muslims in the U.S. Military. He argued that Muslim soldiers should be exempt from deployment to Muslim-majority countries, and defined what he called adverse events that could result if they were not, listing espionage and targeting fellow soldiers among them. Dr. Val Finnell, who was present, later testified that Hasan told the room Islamic law superseded the U.S. Constitution. The instructor interrupted the session. No disciplinary action followed. By spring 2008, a formal review was convened. Dr. John Bradley, Dr. Robert Ursano, Dr. Charles Engel, Dr. Carol Diebold, and Dr. Scott Moran met specifically to assess Hasan's fitness. The group discussed whether his behavior indicated psychosis. Their conclusion: insufficient grounds for removal. In May 2009, Nidal Hasan was promoted to major. His performance memo was forwarded to his next assignment. His new commanders received it and assigned him anyway. Every warning was on record. Not one of them stopped what was coming. On May 31, 2001, the Hasan family gathered at the Dar al-Hijra Islamic Center in Falls Church, Virginia, to lay Nidal's mother to rest. The imam leading that congregation at the time was Anwar al-Awlaki. That name would not mean much to most Americans in 2001. Within a decade, it would appear in the files of nearly every major terrorism investigation on United States soil. Al-Awlaki was a Yemeni-American cleric, articulate, English-speaking, and by all intelligence assessments, one of the most effective extremist recruiters operating anywhere in the world. His ability to reach Western Muslim audiences in their own language made him uniquely dangerous. Federal investigators would later connect him to the 2009 Christmas Day underwear bomb attempt, the 2010 cargo plane bomb plots, and a list of radicalization cases that stretched across multiple countries. But what makes the Dar al-Hijra connection significant goes beyond Hasan. According to the 9/11 Commission report, two of the men who carried out the September 11th attacks, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Hani Hanjour, both hijackers aboard American Airlines Flight 77, the aircraft that struck the Pentagon, also attended Dar al-Hijra. They were there during the same period Hasan was present at that mosque. Al-Awlaki, according to the commission, introduced al-Hazmi to another worshipper who helped him secure housing in Alexandria, Virginia. The same cleric. The same mosque. Two separate attacks on American soil, separated by 8 years. Hasan also attended the Muslim Community Center in Silver Spring, Maryland during this period, a fact later confirmed by the center's imam, Faisal Khan. He was moving through multiple communities, and those who observed him noted a particular intensity when al-Awlaki's name or teachings came up in conversation. A Muslim officer who knew Hasan at Fort Hood later stated that Hasan's demeanor visibly changed when al-Awlaki was mentioned. His eyes, the officer said, lit up. Investigators who later searched Hasan's apartment found a business card. It identified him as a psychiatrist. In the corner, beneath his credentials, were the letters SOA, followed by the abbreviation SWT in parentheses. Intelligence analysts confirmed that SOA was shorthand used across jihadist platforms to mean soldier of Allah. He was carrying that card while treating United States soldiers. Separately, investigators also established that Hasan had made attempts to reach members of al-Qaeda directly during this period. Those contacts, according to intelligence assessments, did not result in any operational response. Al-Qaeda, it appeared, did not take him seriously. Al-Awlaki was located by United States forces in Yemen and was eliminated in a drone strike on September 30, 2011, nearly 2 years after Fort Hood and before Hasan's court-martial began. He never faced a courtroom for his role in the cases connected to his influence. But the thread he represented, from a funeral in Falls Church, Virginia, to the deadliest attack on a United States military installation in modern history, is a matter of documented record. In December 2008, Nidal Hasan opened his email and typed the first of what would become 18 messages to Anwar al-Awlaki. He opened by referencing their prior connection, the mosque in Virginia, the congregation they had both been part of. It was not an introduction. It was a resumption. Over the following 6 months, from December 2008 through June 2009, Hasan sent 18 emails to a man the federal government was actively monitoring as a national security threat. In those messages, he asked whether it was religiously permissible for a Muslim soldier to take the lives of American military personnel. He expressed admiration for individuals who had carried out suicide attacks. He sought religious guidance on the concept of martyrdom. He framed himself as a man caught between two identities, a Muslim and a soldier in an army at war with Muslim nations, and he was asking al-Awlaki to help him resolve that conflict. Al-Awlaki responded. After the attack, al-Awlaki confirmed publicly that Hasan had confided things in him that he had never shared with anyone else. Al-Awlaki also stated publicly that he had neither directed nor pressured Hasan to act. But he added one line that federal investigators took note of. He said, and this is a direct quote, "Maybe Nidal was affected by one of my lectures." Every one of those 18 emails was intercepted. The NSA captured the communications and passed them to the Joint Terrorism Task Force. The FBI conducted what it formally described as an assessment. What happened next was not a cover-up. It was something in some ways more troubling, a structural failure so routine that nobody flagged it in time. 2 separate FBI field offices were involved. One was monitoring Hasan. The other was managing the broader surveillance operation around al-Awlaki. Those 2 offices never coordinated. The complete picture, Hasan's emails alongside al-Awlaki's full profile, was never assembled in a single file and reviewed by a single set of eyes. When the FBI agent assigned to Hasan's case contacted Walter Reed to gather background information, the agent reached the security office. Standard procedure. But the security office produced a general personnel file. What it did not contain, and what was never requested, was the training file. The thick folder that held Dr. Scott Moran's formal memo, the documentation from the 2007 academic presentation, and the records from the spring 2008 physician review. None of it was seen. None of it was factored into the assessment. The official FBI conclusion: the emails were consistent with authorized research, given that Hasan was known to be writing a paper on Islam and military service. The file was closed. In May 2009, a username reading Nidal Hasan appeared on an Islamic discussion website. The post drew a comparison between suicide attackers and soldiers who throw themselves on a grenade to protect their unit, framing ideological self-sacrifice as an act equivalent to military valor. Government analysts monitoring the site saw the post. They did not connect the username to the Army major whose emails they had recently reviewed and cleared. Then on June 1, 2009, a shooting occurred at a military recruiting office in Little Rock, Arkansas. The gunman was Abdul Hakim Mujahid Muhammad. 2 recruiters were targeted. Hasan's response, shared with colleagues, was to call it a sign. He told people around him that Muslims had an obligation to stand against what he called the aggressor, a term he was using to describe American forces. The Senate Homeland Security Committee later investigated the full sequence of events. Their report was titled A Ticking Time Bomb. Its conclusion was unambiguous: the attack at Fort Hood was preventable. The information existed. The warnings were on record. 9 of Hasan's supervisors were formally reprimanded after the fact. By late October 2009, Nidal Hasan's deployment orders were confirmed. He was being sent to Afghanistan. This was the assignment he had spent years working to avoid. He had previously consulted a military attorney about the possibility of being discharged as a conscientious objector on religious grounds. That effort produced nothing. The orders stood. He was going. He told colleagues directly that he would not be deploying. The statement was noted by those who heard it. It was not formally reported up the chain of command. What happened in the 48 hours that followed was only fully understood in retrospect. The day before November 5th, neighbors in his apartment complex noticed Hasan moving through the hallways with belongings, furniture, clothing, personal items, copies of the Quran, offering them to anyone who would take them. That evening he had dinner with a friend he had met through his mosque. During that conversation, Hasan told him that the Quran was clear on the matter. A Muslim could not take up arms against fellow Muslims. He said he felt he was supposed to quit. His friend later recalled the conversation as one that, at the time, seemed like the frustration of a man struggling with his conscience. In hindsight, it was something else entirely. On the morning of November 5th, Hasan approached a neighbor and offered her a bag of vegetables, a Quran, and whatever remained of his personal belongings. He asked her to give anything she did not want to the Salvation Army. Before he left, he said 3 words: "I'm ready." He then attended Far, the pre-dawn Islamic prayer, at a local mosque. What investigators later established through purchase records and witness accounts was that Hasan had not arrived at this moment unprepared. In the weeks prior, he had visited Guns Galore, a firearms dealer in Killeen, Texas. Army Specialist William Gilbert, a regular customer at the store, recalled Hasan walking in and asking for the most technologically advanced weapon on the market with the highest standard magazine capacity. He purchased an FN-57 semi-automatic pistol, returning to the store weekly to acquire additional magazines. In total, he accumulated 3,000 rounds of 5.7 by 28 mm ammunition, a figure that stood in stark contrast to the figure of over 200 rounds that was widely reported in initial coverage. He also visited an outdoor shooting range in Florence, Texas, where he practiced on silhouette targets at distances of up to 100 yards, repeatedly, until his accuracy was consistent. On the morning of the attack, he carried 2 weapons. The FN-57 fitted with 2 laser sights, one red, one green, both confirmed by multiple survivor accounts, and a Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum revolver. Forensic analysis later confirmed the revolver was never discharged. He had one weapon for the task, and he had prepared for it with precision. At 1:34 p.m. on November 5, 2009, Nidal Hasan walked into the Soldier Readiness Processing Center at Fort Hood, Texas. The room was occupied by soldiers working through final administrative and medical checks before overseas deployment. Support staff and civilians were present alongside uniformed personnel. It was a routine processing day. Nothing about it was unusual until Hasan spoke to a soldier standing near the entrance. He said, "I'm going to do good work for God." Then he walked inside. He stood on a table, declared, "Allahu Akbar," and opened fire. What is established by forensic analysis and survivor testimony is that Hasan moved through the room with deliberate intent. He did not fire indiscriminately. Investigators confirmed that he passed multiple opportunities to fire on civilians and concentrated his targeting on uniformed soldiers. Those soldiers, in accordance with standard military base policy, were not carrying personal sidearms inside the processing center. They had no means to return fire. Staff Sergeant Alonzo Lunsford, a healthcare specialist, was shot 7 times. He lost most of the sight in his left eye. He survived by lying still on the floor. He later told investigators that as he lay there, he could hear Hasan counting his rounds between reloads, methodical, unhurried. Staff Sergeant Patrick Ziegler was shot 4 times, including once in the head. Physicians told his family to prepare for the worst. He survived, but sustained permanent partial paralysis on his left side. Specialist Logan Burnett, in the moment Hasan stopped to reload, picked up a table and threw it at him. Burnett was shot in the hip. He crawled to a nearby office cubicle and waited. Captain John Gaffney, 56, from Serra Mesa, California, moved toward Hasan holding a folding chair. He did not reach him. Michael Grant Cahill, 62, a civilian physician assistant from Cameron, Texas, did the same. He also charged with a chair. He also did not reach him. Both men were struck and did not survive. Those who knew Michael Cahill said that anyone who understood who he was would not have been surprised. Moving toward danger rather than away from it was consistent with everything about him. Herman Toro, the director of the Soldier Readiness Processing Site, rushed toward a colleague who had gone down near the north side of the medical building. As he moved through the room, the red beam of Hasan's laser sight crossed his chest. Hasan did not fire. Toro took cover behind an electrical box on the far side of the room. From that position, he watched the final moments of the attack unfold. On the east side of the building, 2 soldiers and a site worker broke through a window and fled into the parking lot. One soldier sustained a hand injury from the glass. They survived. The attack lasted approximately 10 minutes. When it was over, 13 people were dead and 32 others had been wounded. Department of the Army Civilian Police Officer Kimberly Munley was among the first to respond. She engaged Hasan directly and exchanged fire with him before being shot 3 times. She went down. Her partner, Sergeant Mark Todd, arrived and confronted Hasan. Todd fired 5 shots. Hasan, at that point, had emptied his weapon and was reaching for another magazine when he was struck. Todd crossed the room, kicked the pistol out of reach, and placed Hasan in handcuffs as he lost consciousness. The Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum revolver Hasan carried was recovered at the scene. Forensic analysis confirmed it had never been discharged. Hasan was transported to Scott and White Memorial Hospital in Temple, Texas, and later transferred to Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio. These are the 13 people who did not leave that building. Michael Grant Cahill, 62, civilian physician assistant from Cameron, Texas. Married for 37 years. Father of 3. He had returned to work just the week before after recovering from a heart attack. Lieutenant Colonel Juanita Warman, 55, from Havre de Grace, Maryland. A physician assistant and mental health counselor. She had 2 daughters and 6 grandchildren. She was preparing to deploy to Iraq. Major Libardo Eduardo Caraveo, 52, from Woodbridge, Virginia. He was born in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, and arrived in the United States as a teenager with limited English. He earned a doctorate in psychology from the University of Arizona. He had arrived at Fort Hood only days before the attack. Captain Russell Seeger, 51, from Racine, Wisconsin. A licensed clinical social worker and United States Army Reserve officer. Captain John Gaffney, 56, from Serra Mesa, California. He ran toward the threat. Staff Sergeant Justin DeCrow, 32, from Plymouth, Indiana. Married and father to a 13-year-old daughter. He had transferred to Fort Hood from South Korea just weeks earlier. Specialist Frederick Green, 29, from Mountain City, Tennessee. Sergeant Amy Kruger, 29, from Kiel, Wisconsin. She enlisted in the United States Army specifically in response to the September 11th attacks. She was preparing to deploy to Afghanistan. Specialist Jason Hunt, 22, from Norman, Oklahoma. He had been married for 2 months. Private First Class Michael Pearson, 22, from Bolingbrook, Illinois. Private First Class Aaron Nemelka, 19, from West Jordan, Utah. The youngest of the 13. Specialist Cam Sheong, 23, from St. Paul, Minnesota. Hmong American. Married with 3 young children. His widow, Shuaher, later testified at sentencing. She said, "I feel dead, yet I am alive." Private First Class Francesca Velez, 21, from Chicago, Illinois. She had returned from a deployment to Iraq 3 days before the attack. She was 3 months pregnant. Her father, Juan Guillermo Velez, traveled to Texas to testify at sentencing. He delivered his statement in Spanish. He told the court that his daughter had come home from a war zone, and that she had been taken from him anyway, inside an American military base by an American military officer. 13 people. Each one with a name. Each one with people waiting for them to come home. The investigation that followed November 5, 2009 confirmed what the evidence already indicated. This was not a spontaneous act. The date had been chosen deliberately. The units processing through the Soldier Readiness Center that day were the same units Hasan was scheduled to deploy with. The weapon had been researched and purchased weeks prior. 3,000 rounds of ammunition had been stockpiled. Range practice had been completed. Forensic investigators found nothing suggesting impulse. Every element pointed to deliberate, advanced planning. What followed the investigation opened a wound that survivors are still fighting to close. The Department of Defense officially classified the attack as workplace violence, not terrorism. The distinction carried direct legal consequences. Survivors were denied combat-related benefits and Purple Hearts were withheld. Staff Sergeant Sean Manning, shot 6 times and still carrying 2 bullets in his body, received a formal DoD letter stating his injuries did not qualify as wounds caused by an instrumentality of war because Hasan's weapon was a privately owned pistol, not Army-issued. Days after the attack, Army Chief of Staff General George Casey stated publicly that it would be a greater tragedy if diversity became a casualty of Fort Hood. For the families of 13 people, that statement was difficult to process. In November 2011, survivors and families filed a civil lawsuit against the federal government seeking compensation and a formal terrorism reclassification. It took an act of Congress to move the needle. The 2015 National Defense Authorization Act authorized the Purple Heart for military victims and the Defense of Freedom Medal for civilians. On April 10, 2015, 5.5 years after the attack, Army Secretary John McHugh formally presented those awards. The legal proceedings began on November 18, 2009, when Colonel James L. Pohl at the Article 32 hearing recommended a full court-martial with the death penalty as an eligible outcome. Hasan was arraigned on July 20, 2011. Judge Colonel Gregory Gross set a trial date of March 5, 2012. That date was not kept. A prolonged legal dispute over Hasan's beard, which he had grown citing religious observance, in violation of military regulations, delayed proceedings by over a year. Judge Gross was eventually replaced by Judge Colonel Tara Osborne. The trial opened on August 6, 2013. Hasan dismissed his civilian attorney John Galligan and announced he would represent himself. Judge Osborne warned him directly, the decision was unwise, he would be held to full attorney standards, and the jury would decide whether he lived or died. He proceeded anyway. Under military law, A guilty plea is not permitted in a capital case. His stated intention to argue he had acted in defense of others was also rejected. Motive is not a legal element of the charges. The prosecution was led by Colonel Stephen Henricks and Colonel Michael Mulligan. Standby defense counsel Lieutenant Colonel Chris Poppy sat to the side, largely sidelined. In his opening statement, Hasan told the jury, "The evidence will clearly show that I am the shooter." He then said, "I switched sides. I am now a mujahid." Over 12 days, nearly 90 witnesses testified. Hasan cross-examined none of them, called no witnesses of his own, and offered no closing argument. Lieutenant Colonel Poppy filed a formal ethics objection in open court, arguing that assisting a defendant deliberately seeking his own execution was professionally untenable. Judge Osborne denied it. On August 23, 2013, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict on all 45 counts. On August 28, they sentenced him to death, after 7 hours of deliberation across 2 days. He was stripped of his rank, his pay, and all military benefits, forfeiting approximately $300,000 in salary collected during the 4 years he awaited trial. The court-martial cost approximately $5 million in total. Hasan was transferred to the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, the only maximum security military prison in the country. From death row, nothing changed. In 2014, he wrote to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi requesting formal ISIS citizenship, signing the letter SOA, Soldier of Allah. In 2017, he produced a written statement maintaining his actions were religiously justified. He told mental health evaluators that execution would make him a martyr and that he accepted that outcome. He has never expressed regret. On September 11, 2023, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces unanimously upheld his sentence. On March 31, 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final petition. Every legal avenue closed. On September 24, 2025, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth announced he was seeking formal execution approval from President Donald Trump. If carried out, it would be the first U.S. military execution since 1961. Survivor Julia Wilson said she is fully in favor. Alonzo Lunsford said he does not deserve to breathe. Dr. Kathy Platoni said the execution is long overdue, but that full justice also requires the attack be formally reclassified as terrorism. As of this recording, that has not happened. The Fort Hood attack did not happen because one man radicalized in secret. It happened because a system of trained professionals, psychiatrists, FBI agents, military commanders, each held a piece of the picture and none of them assembled it. 13 people paid the price. Nidal Hasan wanted to be remembered as a martyr. What he became is a warning. The Supreme Court has closed every appeal. The Secretary of Defense is pushing for execution. So here is the question, should Nidal Hasan face that sentence? Or has 16 years in a wheelchair on death row, stripped of the martyrdom he wanted, already been consequence enough? Leave your answer in the comments.
I did not kill Renee and the kids, and I believe I was framed.
A Gulf War Army veteran convicted of a quadruple murder in Okaloosa County is set to be executed any moment now. Jeffrey Hutchinson was convicted in 2001 for the murder of his girlfriend and her 3 children in Crestview in 1998. Hutchinson is set to be the 4th person executed in Florida this year. Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant for Hutchinson last month.
Florida State Prison. May 1, 2025. 7:58 in the evening. The warden steps forward. He has one question for the man strapped to that gurney. Does he have any final words? Jeffrey Hutchinson says nothing. No confession. No apology. No last statement maintaining his innocence after 26 years of claiming it. Just silence. But the witnesses in that room noticed something. His lips were moving. Barely. Quietly. As if he was saying something he had no intention of sharing with anyone else in that chamber. Whatever it was, he took it with him. Here is what we know about this case going in. 4 people were found dead inside a home in Crestview, Florida in September of 1998. A Gulf War veteran who served as an Army Ranger was convicted of all 4 counts and sentenced to death. He spent 26 years on death row maintaining he did not do it. 129 military veterans wrote directly to the governor of Florida asking him to stop the execution. And a federal court never reviewed the core of his case, not because the arguments were thrown out, but because his own legal team missed a filing deadline. That last detail alone raises a question this case never fully resolved. When a soldier comes home from war with a damaged mind and no adequate support, and then something unthinkable happens, where does personal responsibility end and systemic failure begin? That question followed this case from a quiet street in Crestview, Florida, all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And by the end of this documentary, you will have every verified fact, every piece of forensic evidence, every legal decision, and every voice that shaped this case, and you can decide for yourself. Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson was born on November 6, 1962, in Alaska. He grew up in Kettle Falls, Washington, a small rural town near the Canadian border, the kind of place where most people know each other and life moves at a steady, predictable pace. He was raised in a working-class family alongside several brothers and sisters, including his brother Robert, who years later would become his most vocal defender. By every account, his early life gave no indication of what was coming. After high school, he worked steady jobs, first as a mechanic, then as a security guard. No criminal record, no history of violence, no red flags of any kind. Then in 1986, at the age of 23, Jeffrey Hutchinson enlisted in the United States Army. He did not just serve, he advanced. After time in the National Guard, he transitioned to active duty and earned two of the most demanding designations in the U.S. military, paratrooper and Army Ranger. The Ranger program is one of the most physically and mentally grueling selection processes in the American Armed Forces. Fewer than half of candidates complete it. Hutchinson did. In 1990, he was deployed to the Middle East as part of Operation Desert Storm, the U.S.-led military campaign to drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. He served in forward positions in some of the most hazardous environments of that conflict. What happened to him there did not stay on the battlefield. During his deployment, Hutchinson was exposed to sarin gas and sustained multiple blast injuries. The long-term consequence was Gulf War illness, a condition the U.S. Department of Defense estimates affected between 175,000 and 250,000 veterans of that war. It is not a disputed diagnosis. It is documented, recognized, and in many cases permanent. The condition causes chronic physical deterioration, cognitive decline, memory loss, and in a significant number of veterans, severe and lasting psychological damage. When Hutchinson came home, the people closest to him noticed the difference almost immediately. He developed skin rashes and lesions that did not resolve. He was frequently coughing. He became hypervigilant, constantly on edge in environments that posed no real threat. His memory, once reliable, began to fail him in ways his family found difficult to watch. A neurologist who examined him in the period before his trial documented what he described as numerous signs of Gulf War illness. Those who had known him before the deployment described a man who had come back fundamentally different from the one who had left. 2 marriages followed his discharge from the Army. Both ended. His stability, which had once defined him, was gone. And then, in 1997, something shifted. He met someone. He started over. Or at least, that is what it looked like from the outside. But before we get to that, there is one voice from this case that most people have never heard. A voice that cuts through everything. Shortly after Hutchinson's arrest in 1998, a reporter from where TV News sat down with his biological son, also named Jeffrey Hutchinson, who was 12 years old at the time. The boy said this about his father. He just had sudden mood swings. Same thing happens to me. One minute you're calm, the next you're mad. And then he said something that very few 12-year-olds would say about a parent. I'm kinda sad because my dad's in jail. But he should be there so he can get some psychiatric help. A 12-year-old boy, talking about his father, saying he belonged in custody, not because he was dangerous but because he was unwell and no one had helped him. That statement has never made a headline. But it tells you more about the years leading up to this case than almost anything else in the record. Renee Ladian Flareity was 32 years old. She worked part-time for the Postal Service out of Niceville, Florida, a small town in the same Panhandle region where she would later build what she believed was a fresh start. She was a mother first. Everything else came second. Her marriage had effectively ended before it was formally over. Her husband, a military man, was stationed far away at a base in Alaska's Aleutian Islands. By the time Renee met Jeffrey Hutchinson, she was raising her 3 children largely on her own. Those 3 children were everything. Jeffrey was 9 years old, the eldest, the one the family described as sharp and academically minded, the kind of kid who paid attention and remembered things. Amanda was 7. Her uncle Wesley would later describe her as a typical little girl who loved Barbies and the kinds of things 7-year-old girls love. And then there was Logan, 4 years old. His uncle's description of him was simple and precise, a bundle of energy. 3 children. 3 completely distinct personalities. All of them under the age of 10. When Renee and Jeffrey's relationship developed, the decision was made to relocate. They moved from Deer Park, Washington to Crestview, Florida, a town in Okaloosa County in the state's Panhandle. Jeffrey had plans to open a motorcycle shop. Renee brought her children. The household became, by all outward appearances, a functioning blended family. People who knew them said Jeffrey treated those children as though they were his own. His friend Creighton Adams put it plainly. He said you would have thought they were his kids. That is how he acted around them, and that is how they responded to him. Before the move, Renee's brother Wesley Elmore said goodbye to his sister. He turned to Jeffrey and said 4 words that would stay with this case for the next 26 years. Take care of my sister and her kids. Jeffrey looked at him and responded without hesitation. I will. I love your sister. Renee's mother, Melva Elmore, was the quiet center of that family. She watched her daughter leave for Florida with 3 grandchildren and what looked like a real chance at a stable life. She had no reason to believe otherwise. They were never married. Jeffrey and Renee were cohabiting partners, a detail that would matter later when the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office classified what happened in that house as a domestic violence homicide. But in those early months in Crestview, none of that language existed yet. There was just a woman, her 3 children, and a man who everyone around them believed genuinely cared about all 4 of them. That is what made what came next so difficult for everyone who knew them to process. By the time September of 1998 arrived, Jeffrey Hutchinson and Renee Flareity had been living together at their home on John King Road in Crestview for approximately 18 months. To everyone around them, the household appeared stable. There were no police calls to that address. No documented disputes that had escalated to the point of outside intervention. No restraining orders. No prior incidents on record between the 2 of them. Investigators who later reviewed the history of that address confirmed it. There was no escalating pattern of violence. No paper trail suggesting what was coming. By every external measure, this was an ordinary household. On the morning of September 11, 1998, Jeffrey's brother Dan spoke with him by phone. During that call, Dan could hear Jeffrey and Renee in the background together. He described them as laughing and joking around the way they normally did. Nothing in that conversation gave Dan any reason for concern. He said later that nothing seemed amiss. That phone call happened hours before everything changed. When news of what occurred that night began to spread through Crestview and across Okaloosa County the following morning, the reaction from the community was one of complete disbelief. The Flareity family murders, as they came to be known, sent a wave of shock through the region that did not fade quickly. People who lived nearby, who had seen that family come and go, who had no reason to expect anything other than an ordinary Thursday morning, found themselves confronting something none of them had anticipated. There is one final detail about that address on John King Road that is worth noting here. In 2016, nearly 18 years after the events of September 1998, a separate and unrelated violent incident occurred at that same location. A 22-year-old man named Jacob Langston was involved in a multiple victim assault at the same address. That incident drew renewed attention back to the Hutchinson case and left many in the community asking why that particular address kept appearing in the worst kind of news. It remains one of the more unsettling footnotes attached to this case and to that street in Crestview. The evening of September 11, 1998 began like any other at the house on John King Road. Then an argument broke out between Jeffrey Hutchinson and Renee Flareity. Court records do not specify what the argument was about. What they do document is what happened next. Hutchinson packed his belongings into his Dodge pickup truck and left the house. He drove to an AmVets lounge in Okaloosa County. At the bar he drank beer. At some point during the evening he told another patron that Renee was pissed off at him and that they just needed time to cool down. To the people around him at that bar, he appeared to be a man blowing off steam after a domestic dispute. Nothing more. Back at the house on John King Road, Renee was not calm. She called a friend, identified in court records as Miss Pruitt. According to those records, Renee was described during that call as sobbing. She was distressed and struggling to compose herself. That phone call was later submitted as evidence at trial and admitted by the court as an excited utterance, meaning the emotional state in which it was made gave it evidentiary weight. Renee also called her mother, Melva Elmore, during this same period. She told her mother that Jeffrey had taken her keys and that she did not know where he was. Those were among the last documented communications Renee Flareity ever made. Approximately 40 minutes after leaving the AmVets lounge, Hutchinson returned to the house. At 8:41 in the evening, a 911 call was received from the John King Road address. The male caller said, "Yes, ma'am. I just shot my family. I love my family. Ma'am, I love my family." When Okaloosa County deputies arrived at the scene, they found Jeffrey Hutchinson lying face down on the floor of the garage. A cordless phone was inches from his hand, still connected to the 911 operator. He did not attempt to flee. He did not resist. He stood up when officers approached and was taken into custody without incident. Inside the house, deputies found Renee Flareity and her 3 children. All 4 had lost their lives. What investigators documented inside that home was methodical and precise. A 12-gauge pistol-grip Mossberg shotgun was found on the kitchen counter. 5 shotgun shells, later linked to that weapon, were recovered from the same counter. For people, 5 shells. That arithmetic became one of the prosecution's central arguments when the case went to trial. The medical examiner who testified at trial stated that the physical evidence suggested at least 2 of the children had some awareness of what was happening before they were killed. In his written sentencing order, Circuit Judge G. Robert Barron addressed this directly. He noted that Jeffrey, the 9-year-old, had attempted to protect himself in those final moments. The judge wrote that we will never know the full horror that child experienced. That line came from an official court document. It was not narration. It was a sitting judge's written finding after reviewing every piece of evidence in this case. Jeffrey Hutchinson was taken into custody that night on 4 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. In the hours following Hutchinson's arrest, investigators from the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office began processing the scene on John King Road with methodical precision. What they found, piece by piece, built a picture that pointed in one direction. The first confirmed finding was gunshot residue on Hutchinson's hands. That alone placed him in direct contact with a recently discharged firearm. The second finding went further. Human tissue belonging to Jeffrey Flareity, the last of the 4 victims, was recovered from Hutchinson's leg. Not from the scene in a general sense. From his body. The third finding was blood on Hutchinson's clothing at the time of his arrest. This was documented separately from the gunshot residue. 2 distinct categories of physical evidence, both recovered from the same man. Then came what investigators did not find. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. Every point of access was examined. None showed any indication that anyone had broken in from the outside. There was no physical evidence of any other person having been inside that home that night. No fingerprints. No trace evidence. No biological material connecting anyone other than Hutchinson and the victims to that scene. And then there was Hutchinson himself. When deputies took him into custody, they examined him for injuries. A man who had allegedly been overpowered and physically restrained by 2 intruders inside a home should have shown some sign of that struggle. He had none. No cuts. No bruising. No defensive marks of any kind on his body. Investigators confronted Hutchinson with what they had found. His account was immediate and unwavering. He told them that two men wearing ski masks had broken into the house, overpowered him, carried out the killings, and fled before law enforcement arrived. The gunshot residue on his hands, he said, came from struggling with those men, not from firing the weapon himself. Investigators pushed back. They told him directly that the evidence did not support that account. His response, captured in the interrogation transcript, was this: "What the hell are you talking about? Nobody is looking for them?" That second question stopped investigators. Nobody is looking for them. It was a strange and specific thing to say for a man who had just described two killers fleeing into the night. It read less like a protest and more like a man struggling to track the conversation, detached from the reality of what had just taken place in that house. Hutchinson never changed his account. Not that night. Not at trial. Not in 26 years on death row. On October 5, 1998, an Okaloosa County grand jury reviewed the evidence and returned a formal indictment. Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson was charged on 4 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. The case was heading to court. And what happened there would raise questions that went far beyond the walls of that house on John King Road. The case against Jeffrey Hutchinson did not reach a courtroom quickly. The road to trial stretched across more than 2 years, marked by repeated delays that added layers of complexity before a single witness was ever called. The trial was initially scheduled well before it actually began. It was pushed back once, then pushed back again to July of 2000. Then came a development that halted proceedings entirely. Bobby Elmore, the lead prosecutor assigned to the case, suffered a heart attack. He needed time to recover before he could return to court. The trial was delayed again. During this same period, Hutchinson filed a formal complaint against his own defense lawyers. By the time the case finally opened, it had already been through more legal turbulence than most cases ever see. On January 8, 2001, the trial of Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson began in Okaloosa County Circuit Court before Judge G. Robert Barron. Before testimony started, there was a critical threshold to clear. The court had to determine whether Hutchinson was mentally competent to stand trial at all. 2 experts were brought in and they arrived at opposing conclusions. Dr. Vincent Dillon, a psychiatrist, examined Hutchinson and found that he met the criteria for bipolar disorder. He documented delusions and paranoia and concluded that Hutchinson was not competent to stand trial. Psychologist James Larson reached a different conclusion entirely. He diagnosed a behavioral disorder rather than a clinical mental illness and determined that Hutchinson was competent to proceed. On January 7, 2001, one day before the trial opened, Judge Barron sided with Larson. The trial moved forward. Defense attorney Stephen Cobb entered the courtroom and described his client in 4 words that framed the entire defense strategy. He called Jeffrey Hutchinson a mentally incapacitated soldier of misfortune. The prosecution, led by Bobby Elmore, took a different approach entirely. Elmore built his case on the physical evidence and let it speak for itself. Then came the first of 2 decisions by Hutchinson that would define the outcome of this trial in ways that are still debated today. Hutchinson refused to allow his defense team to present an insanity defense. The reason was straightforward and significant. Mounting an insanity defense required acknowledging that he was the person who committed the acts in question. Hutchinson would not do that. He maintained his innocence absolutely. As a direct result of that decision, the jury sitting in that courtroom never heard the full scope of his Gulf War mental health evidence. The psychiatric evaluations, the neurological findings, the documented symptoms, none of it was presented to the 12 people deciding his fate. It was held back entirely for the sentencing phase, where only the judge would hear it. The second decision was equally consequential. After the jury returned its verdict, Hutchinson waived his right to have that jury determine his sentence. On January 21, 2001, Judge Barron conducted a formal legal proceeding to confirm the waiver. He found it was made voluntarily. The jury was excused from the sentencing process entirely. From that point forward, the question of whether Jeffrey Hutchinson would live or die rested with one man, Judge G. Robert Barron alone. During the sentencing phase, Dr. William Baumswager, a psychiatrist from California who had previously examined cases involving Gulf War veterans, testified that Hutchinson's exposure to chemical agents during his deployment had diminished his mental state at the time of the crimes. That testimony was now before the judge. It had never reached the jury. The defense also presented evidence that Hutchinson's blood alcohol level at the time of the events was somewhere between 0.21 and 0.26. Florida's legal limit is 0.08. His level was more than double that threshold. The defense argued that degree of intoxication made first-degree premeditation impossible. The prosecution countered that the sequence of actions that night, the argument, the departure, the time at the bar, the return, demonstrated deliberate and purposeful conduct regardless of his condition. On January 18, 2001, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. On February 6, 2001, Judge Barron handed down the sentence. For the deaths of Jeffrey, Amanda, and Logan Flareity, Hutchinson received 3 separate death sentences. The judge cited the young ages of the 3 children as the decisive aggravating factor in that determination. For the death of Renee Flareity, he received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, Hutchinson stood in court and said, "I did not kill Renee and the kids. I believe I was framed." Outside the courtroom, Renee's mother Melva Elmore spoke to reporters. Her response to the verdict was 4 words: "Justice has prevailed." Years later, Bobby Elmore, the prosecutor who had survived a heart attack to see this case through, was asked about the evidence against Hutchinson. His assessment had not changed. The forensics proved conclusively that he had done it. This case is exactly the kind of case this channel exists to cover. One where the verdict is on record, the evidence is documented, but the full story runs deeper than any headline ever captured. If you are watching this and you want more cases like this one, subscribe right now. Every week we go deeper. Every week we find the details that did not make the front page. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. The verdict in February 2001 was not the end of this case. It was the beginning of a legal battle that would run for 24 years. In 2002, Hutchinson's team filed their first post-conviction motion. On July 1, 2004, the Florida Supreme Court rejected his direct appeal, ruling that the deliberate taking of 3 young children's lives outweighed every mitigating factor, including his military service. A second Florida Supreme Court appeal was rejected on July 9, 2009. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals dismissed another challenge on April 19, 2012. Then came the most consequential procedural fact in this entire case, one that almost no headline ever covered. Under federal law, a death-sentence prisoner has exactly 1 year to file a federal habeas appeal after their state conviction becomes final. Hutchinson's attorneys miscalculated that deadline and missed it. No federal court ever reviewed his military trauma claims on the merits. Not because those arguments were rejected, because the filing was late. In 2022, attorneys argued that 2 key prosecution witnesses had been separately investigated by the FBI. The Florida Supreme Court reviewed and rejected the argument. The investigations did not point to any alternative perpetrator. In 2024, the family produced a video for a state clemency hearing. Hutchinson's son Jeffrey said on camera, "He was a soldier who didn't get the help he needed. He at least deserves some leniency for that." DeSantis formally rejected clemency and on March 31, 2025, signed the death warrant. A final competency challenge was filed in April 2025. Dr. Barry Crown evaluated Hutchinson twice and concluded he held a fixed delusion, that his execution was a government operation to silence him. On April 27, Judge James Callow rejected the argument. Jeffrey Hutchinson does not lack the mental capacity to understand the reason for the pending execution. 129 veterans, co-signed by both Floridians for alternatives to the death penalty and conservatives concerned about the death penalty, wrote to DeSantis. Their letter stated, "His mind was a casualty just like any limb lost in combat." DeSantis did not intervene. May 1, 2025. Jeffrey Hutchinson woke at 4:30 in the morning. His final meal was salmon and mahi-mahi, asparagus, a baked potato and iced tea. He finished most of it. At 11 a.m., his sister, an in-law, and a spiritual advisor arrived. His legal team followed to say goodbye. After years of filings and appeals, there was nothing left to submit. At 3:30 p.m., FDOC spokesman Ted Verman confirmed at a press conference that Hutchinson had completed his final visits, was calm and compliant, and that despite a pending stay request, the execution would move forward. Outside the prison, a small group of protesters held signs arguing that doubt should mean life. No intervention came. At 5 p.m., final preparations began. Hutchinson was given fresh clothing and escorted to the room adjacent to the chamber. At 6 p.m. he was led inside. In the witness room, Wesley Elmore, who had flown in from Washington, sat alongside other family members. At 7 p.m., the United States Supreme Court declined his final petition without comment. The warden read the death warrant aloud and asked if Hutchinson had any final words. He said nothing. Witnesses noted his lips moving quietly, as though speaking something meant for no one else in that room. The procedure lasted just over 15 minutes. At 8:15 p.m., Jeffrey Glenn Hutchinson, age 62, was pronounced dead, the fourth person executed in Florida in 2025 and the 15th in the United States that year. Here is what the court record confirms. Renee, Lady and Flareity, Jeffrey, Amanda, and Logan lost their lives in Crestview, Florida on September 11, 1998. Gunshot residue, blood, human tissue, and 5 recovered shells pointed to one man. A jury convicted Jeffrey Hutchinson on all 4 counts, and every court that reviewed that conviction upheld it. But the record also confirms this. No federal court ever reviewed his military trauma evidence, because a filing deadline was missed. 129 veterans told the governor his mind was a casualty of war. His own son said he needed help, not just punishment. After the execution, Governor DeSantis said, "We think he's murdered other people beyond this." That claim has never been proven. Wesley Elmore flew from Washington and said the execution was exactly what should have happened. Robert Hutchinson says his brother was innocent. Darren Johnson said not a day goes by without thinking of the loved ones they lost. 2 families. 1 case. No answer that satisfies both of them. If Hutchinson had received proper veterans care, if a federal court had reviewed that evidence, would this story exist at all? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Every case on this channel comes from court records, verified facts, and details the headlines skipped. Subscribe and hit the bell. The next case is already in production, and if this one left you with questions, the next one will too.